On this slide, we are going to compare the differences between a strong acid and a weak acid. So if, let's see, where did my pen go? There we go. The top part is showing us a strong acid, and that strong acid is shown in the diagram on the left. And then the bottom part is talking about a weak acid, and that's the diagram on the right. So if we are talking about a strong acid, let's start with the chemical reaction over here on the left. On the top part, we are looking at HCl, which is on our short list of strong acids. As soon as HCl dissolves in water, the HCl molecule breaks apart, giving us an H plus ion and a chloride ion. That H plus ion in this representation is shown in the particle diagram, is shown associating with that water molecule, so we end up with the hydronium ion. The first line of the equations is the way I usually write this, HCl and then a one-way arrow because this reaction goes to completion and we get H plus ions and Cl minus ions. The formalism using hydronium includes the water molecule, so we have HCl plus water yields H3O plus Cl minus. If we were to look at that beaker, what we would see, so if we're moving over to this first diagram, and actually let me change tools, I'll move over to, sorry, I thought I had an extra tool that I'm not seeing at the moment. All right. So if we look at this diagram on the left and we move down to the bottom, the first bar in the bar graph is showing how much HCl we have, which means the entire molecule of the hydrogen stuck to the Cl, and we have none because as soon as the HCl hits water, it breaks apart. So every little bit of what we have in that beaker will be H plus ions and Cl minus ions. Now, if we look at the weak acid, HF, and yes, even though all of the other hydrohalogen acids are strong, HF is weak. Don't fall for that on a quiz or a test. HF is a weak acid. So when HF hits water, we establish an equilibrium. So we have to have this double-headed arrow, and being a weak acid, this with a small equilibrium constant, this equilibrium is going to favor reactants over products. So if we move over to that right-hand diagram, we have the HF molecules present to a huge extent, and then only a little bit of the H plus and the F minus. So make sure you're understanding the differences in these two bar graphs and the differences in writing the reaction going to completion versus writing this reaction as an equilibrium. We can have a very similar slide for a base ionization. Something like sodium hydroxide is going to be a strong base. When sodium hydroxide hits water, the sodium ion and the hydroxide ion will separate from one another. And so if we look over at the first diagram, notice down here where it's showing sodium hydroxide, there is no bar because it doesn't exist. It's completely separated. And so we have 100% sodium ions and hydroxide ions. Now for the weak base, we're going to have something called a hydrolysis reaction. Hydro refers to water and lysis refers to breaking. So this is a reaction that breaks water. The ammonia molecule interacts with the water molecule and steals a proton from it, liberating a hydroxide ion. And once that ammonia has stolen that proton, we're going to have an ammonium ion, NH4+. So in the weak base ammonia, the equilibrium constant is very small, which means it favors ammonia molecules. So in this bar graph, we have mostly ammonia, and then we have just a little bit of the hydroxide ion and the ammonium ion. So again, in the strong bases, we've got tons of the hydroxide, which is the active ingredient in a base, and in a weak base, we only have a very little bit of that available. Most of the acids that we will explore as being weak acids are organic chemicals. And organic chemicals are generally based on chains of carbon atoms with a bunch of hydrogens attached to them. But if you have only carbon and hydrogen and it's all single bonds, there just really aren't a lot of chemical reactions that can take place. Burning, combustion, not too much else. So in order to get organic chemicals to do stuff, we have to introduce other things. We have to introduce double bonds, triple bonds, other atoms. They'll be referred to as heteroatoms. In an organic compound, anything other than carbon or hydrogen is considered a heteroatom. Well, to make an organic compound into an acid, we are going to introduce this functional group. So it's heteroatoms of oxygen, and we've got a double bond in there as well. And the hydrogen that will ionize for our H plus ions in the Arrhenius definition or our protons in the Bronsted-Lowry definition, that proton is the one that's attached to the oxygen. That right there is going to be our acidic proton. All of the protons that are directly attached to carbon, these other three on the left side of the molecule, they're not going anywhere. They are not going to ionize. So when we write the formula for this compound, we're going to write the first carbon with what's attached to it, which is CH3, and then the second carbon with everything that's attached to it, which is the COOH. And again, the only acidic proton in this molecule, which is acetic acid, will be that proton that's attached to the oxygen. And one more thing here, when a chemist looks at this, we are so used to seeing that COOH, that carboxyl functional group, that a chemist looks at this and just goes, oh yeah, that's an acid. But students who are learning about this for the first time look at the OH at the end and say, oh, that's hydroxide. That means this is a base. So don't fall for that. If you see an OH, make sure that's it. It's just OH, because if you see this whole thing, COOH, it's actually an acid, not a base. To expand our knowledge of weak bases, let's take a look at our prototype, ammonia. Ammonia is a central nitrogen atom with 3 hydrogens, and it has this trigonal pyramidal Vesper shape because there's also a lone pair of electrons right here on that nitrogen. And that lone pair of electrons makes this guy a base. If we want to use the Bronsted-Lowry definition, that is the site where this molecule can accept a proton. If we want to use the Lewis definition, that's the electron pair that gets donated when we consider a base to be an electron pair donor. So many, many weak bases can be thought of as ammonia molecules which have had one or more of those hydrogen atoms substituted by an organic group. We'll put some sort of carbon-hydrogen chain onto the ammonia molecule in place of one of the hydrogens. The simplest substitution we can make is shown on the right-hand side here. So notice that on the far right, these 2 hydrogens are still the original hydrogens from our ammonia molecule. We still have a lone pair of electrons here on this nitrogen, but now the third hydrogen has been replaced by this CH3 group, which is known as a methyl group. And so the formula now, instead of being NH3, well, there are only 2 hydrogens, so it ends with NH2. And then it also has a CH3 group on it, so we write CH3NH2. CH3 is known as a methyl group. The prefix meth in organic chemistry means that you have 1 carbon. So a carbon with 3 hydrogens is referred to as a methyl. And then amine is telling us that we have this substituted ammonia. Now we could substitute 2 of the hydrogens with a methyl group, and we would have CH3 2NH, because now we're down to just 1 proton attached to the nitrogen, and this would be called dimethylamine. And we could even go all the way to taking all three of those hydrogens and replacing them with methyl groups and have CH3, 3N, and that would be called trimethylamine. So I will do my best when we are working with these weak bases to try to write the formulas in such a way that we've got this lone pair containing nitrogen atom towards the end of the formula to try to help signal that this is a base. Some of the more complicated molecules aren't traditionally written that way, but I'll do my best to stick with ones where you'll be able to go, oh, there's a nitrogen at the end. That must mean it's a base. All right, we're trying to figure out what the hydroxide ion concentration is in 0.1 molar solutions of these three compounds, barium hydroxide, sodium hydroxide, and methylamine. The first sort of classification process that I want you to think about when you're faced with a question like this is strong versus weak. Those top two bases are both strong bases, and the bottom one is a weak base. Being a weak base means it only ionizes a little bit, and so while the molecule may have a concentration of 0.1 molar as it gets dissolved into water, most of that stays as the molecule. Only a teeny bit dissolves, or it all dissolves, but only a teeny bit dissociates to give us hydroxide ions by reacting with water. So the methylamine is going to have the smallest concentration of hydroxide ions. Then we've got to compare sodium hydroxide and barium hydroxide. The sodium is a group 1 metal. Barium is one of the heavier group 2 metals. So both of these are strong bases. But check this out. When sodium hydroxide ionizes, we're going to get a sodium ion and a hydroxide ion. And it ionizes completely, so that's a one-way arrow. So the concentration of hydroxide in this solution will be 0.1 molar. Barium hydroxide is a different story. When barium hydroxide dissociates, we're going to get a Ba+2 ion, but for every one barium, we are going to get 2 hydroxides because of that subscript of 2 outside of the parentheses. So this would be like saying, okay, you've got a car, and now we're going to rip that car apart for parts. For every one car, how many windshield wipers are you going to get? We've got to double the number of cars to get the number of windshield wipers, and that's what's going on here. If our stated concentration is 0.1 molar barium hydroxide, then for every one barium hydroxide, we're going to get 2 hydroxide ions, so the concentration of hydroxide ion will be 0.2 molar. So in ranking these, methylamine is the smallest because it's weak and will have way less than 0.1 molar. Then sodium hydroxide will be next with that concentration of 0.1 molar. And I guess I should fill that in. That's way less than 0.1 molar for methylamine. And then last but not least, we'll have barium hydroxide, which will have a concentration of 0.2 molar for the hydroxide ion. Our objectives were to use a variety of definitions to characterize acids and bases. So we saw Arrhenius, Bronsted-Lowry, and Lewis, and then also to describe protons and water. The whole idea there being we may write H plus aqueous, but the reality is it's got a bunch of waters attached to it. And then we also looked at just really what does it mean if you have a strong base versus a weak base, a strong acid versus a weak acid. And we started taking a look at some of the types of questions you'll be asked about that, like ranking the chemicals in order of smallest to greatest hydroxide ion concentration.